New Delhi, and particularly the government of Prime Minister Modi, plays a critical and essential role. And it can demonstrate this very quickly, very clearly, if we take 3 dates. Right? Because this corridor, what most people don't understand, it's been long in the making. And the government has played a central role. So if we go back to 2020, I'll give you 3 dates: 2020, 2017, 2015, and you'll see how it works. 2020, the UAE was India's third largest trade partner. It was there because in 2017, the Indian government signed a comprehensive strategic partnership with the UAE. And that happened because 2 years earlier, in 2015, Prime Minister Modi visited the United Arab Emirates. And he was the first prime minister to visit, the first Indian prime minister to visit in 34 years. So the actions of individuals in the Indian government really did make a big difference in this case. As we saw in the G20 summit, India adds a very important tone of inclusivity, which is very important. You know, the invitation to African nations to have a seat at the table at the G20 would be a very good example. And I think that tone, which is at the level of rhetoric, should be extended as an open hand by all the G20 countries to come up with these kinds of win-win programs and invite other people to join, looking at countries eye to eye. The G20 is the top 20 economies, but that doesn't mean that one country should look down on the other. The countries should look at each other eye to eye and work shoulder to shoulder. And I think the tone that India has set in the G20 is accomplishes that, and I hope it continues. Just the commercial transportation infrastructure does not make an economic corridor, as I've pointed out. It's a prerequisite, but by itself, it's not enough. What you need are manufacturing value chains. So along the corridor, you need to have investments, joint ventures in factories that employ local people and like employ Indians, contribute to Indian GDP. And this has been happening organically between Israel and India, and then India and the United Arab Emirates, also India and Saudi Arabia. And then the Abraham Accords was able, now all these countries are able to work together. And what we're seeing now is increasing relations with Israel and Saudi Arabia. So the whole thing will come together. So there's one, let me give you a specific example. So there's a food corridor aspect to this. So India is going to produce food and sell it across the way India produces food and why it has had such big yields in the last few years is because of Israeli agricultural technology, high-tech agritech, and water tech. But what happened, for example, one of the top Israeli drip irrigation companies formed a joint venture with Skipper in Hyderabad. So now they're manufacturing those systems in India, and they get to sell them in India with a price advantage because they're making them there, and then sell through Asia. Same, Vyoda did a joint venture with the Israeli company AgroSolar, and now they're making irrigation pumps that are powered by solar power. They're manufacturing them in India. And these are all things that have already happened. So when people say, oh, this is something new, this has already happened. What we see with the IMEC corridor, at least from India all the way to Israel, is that this is organic and it's done by private sector B2B relations. That's different from most of the BRI. Governments have helped. In this case, the Indian government, the Israeli government, the Emirati government, all had very important G2G meetings, institutions, but it's being led by private sector B2B. You cannot say that about the BRI, or for most of it. And this is why the IMEC corridor will have a lot more staying power than the BRI. And so it is a very big deal. And this is why, in fact, the United States didn't engineer this, starting with the I2U2 summit last year. They wanted to get in on it because it was already something that was happening. And now the Europeans want to get in on it. So we see something quite different. It doesn't have to compete in place of the BRI. It could be done alongside the BRI. But what this does is give India and the other partners a much more powerful position at the table in terms of how trade flows are going to be oriented. One of the big missing pieces in the global economy is India European trade and investment. It's something I've already written about elsewhere. I think the Europeans have a hard time wrapping their head around India, to be quite frank. And one of the functions of, I think, the IMEC corridor is that it it gives the Europeans a way to interact. I think this really puts, Greece already on the map. It puts Italy on the map in terms of trade. France, because France also has a Mediterranean coast, potentially Spain, and the other countries, because now they can sort of see how a flow of trade will happen. We have to remember it's 27 countries in the European Union. Some are much more adventurous and already involved in South Asia and Southeast Asia, but others are not, and it's a new thing. So I think the corridor provides a framework for discussion that hadn't been there before. I mean, Europeans are very good at talking about regulations and, but this has left a very big problem for a free trade agreement. But now with a corridor, and people see that map that I was the first one to put out, and then they say, aha, we see how we can invest. We see how it's going to flow. Global South is a kind of Eurocentric term to begin with. South of what? It's south of Europe. I mean, India is north of the equator. But most of what we call a lot of what we call the global south is north of the equator. So, what I think is, again, as I emphasize, these are very pragmatic, private sector arrangements that benefit local communities by creating employment. We've already seen the success in creating skill transfer. A lot of the global South is registering complaints against the West, at least in rhetoric. We just saw the BRIC summit. But in terms of practical arrangements that actually benefit people on the ground and all these factors that I outlined, you see the IMEC corridor having already done that. So what I feel is there are great opportunities for other countries to participate and join in. So for example, Egypt, which was just admitted to the BRICS, a very important player in the region, the largest country in the Mediterranean by population, in the Middle East by population. They can easily be brought in and should be brought in because they control the Suez Canal. I think there's room for Turkey in this arrangement as well, let alone, especially from, India is very sharp on the Indian Ocean region. Well, this corridor certainly can bring in Horn of Africa and East Africa as well. So I think there are a lot of opportunities, and people should look at the model I outlined in my report, because I mean, I did predict this and it has come to pass. But I explained the reasons why, and I think there would be many countries that would be interested on getting those good terms that benefit them, because what we've seen here is an undisputed win-win situation. I think this is something that could greatly empower countries that we refer to as the Global South.